Hello, everyone. Welcome and thank you for joining us this afternoon. I'm Eric Camino. I'm PPMD's Vice President of Research. And thank you for joining us today for our webinar with NS Pharma, who's joined us to talk about Viltepso, which is an approved product for those amenable to exon 53 skipping. And NS Pharma is going to talk a little bit about the efficacy data for Viltepso, along with some of the safety data that they have as well. We are recording this webinar, so if you have any friends or family who this would be relevant to, please feel free to share this with them. It'll be posted on the PPMD website in the next week. And at the end of the presentation today, we will have an open Q&A. So if you have any questions that come up during the presentation about Viltepso, about NS Pharma, please put them into the chat and we will try to address as many of them as possible once we're kind of in that Q&A section. And so I'm going to hand it over to Gilberto. Gil is going to introduce the NS Pharma team, and Gilberto is the Director of Caregiver and Patient Marketing for NS Pharma.
Thanks, Eric. As Eric mentioned, my name's Gilbert Gill. I am the Director of Patient and Caregiver Marketing for NS Pharma. And in my role, I work very closely with our patient services team and our advocacy partners to put on presentations like the one you'll see today. And I will turn it over to my colleague, Judy Cohen, who will be available towards the end of the call to answer any specific questions related to our access and support services. Judy?
Thank you, Gil. So I'm Judy Cohen. I'm the Associate Director of Patient Services and Advocacy at NS Pharma. My team is responsible for helping patients that are interested in accessing Viltepso. So I'll be available, like Gil mentioned, at the end of the presentation to answer any questions that you might have. Thank you.
Great. Well, I just wanted to say thank you to everyone who took time out of their day to be here to see this presentation. And we're very glad to have with us today Dr. Thangarajh, who will be leading the discussion. And I will turn it over to Dr. Thangarajh to do a brief intro and then lead this conversation around Viltepso.
Hello. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm very excited to be here, and I thank NS Pharma for inviting me and PPMD for hosting this seminar. I will be discussing Viltepso, an FDA-approved treatment for patients with Duchenne muscular dystrophy amenable to exon 53 skipping. I'm a child neurologist and neuromuscular physician here at Children's Hospital in Richmond, and I've had a long-standing experience taking care of families and boys with Duchenne muscular dystrophy. Next, please. So Viltepso is indicated for the treatment of Duchenne muscular dystrophy, especially for patients who have a confirmed mutation of the dystrophin gene, which is amenable to exon 53 skipping. This indication was given under accelerated approval by FDA, and this was substantiated by data which showed that there was restoration of dystrophin following those who received Viltepso. Next, please. So I'll go over some very important key safety information with Viltepso. Viltepso is an antisense oligonucleotide. So some of the things that we are very mindful and cautious is to make sure about kidney toxicity. This is because as a class, ASOs have been shown to have renal toxicity, especially in preclinical models. Similarly, in terms of prior to treating patients, some of the things that we always want to make sure is renal function in these children. So we do recommend serum cystatin and a urine dipstick and urine protein to creatinine ratio. This is to be tested prior to commencement of Viltepso. And once the treatment has been initiated, one of the things that we also would recommend is that there continues to be continued monitoring of renal function tests. So this would be to continue again with serum cystatin and or proteinuria. Some of the adverse reactions which has been reported with Viltepso includes upper respiratory infections, injection site, and cough and fever. Next, please. So today, what I'm going to be doing is to indicate who are the children who would benefit from having Viltepso treatment, but the fundamentals of why it's important to treat and commence treatment early, and also to talk a little bit about the role of exon skipping in the treatment of Duchenne muscular dystrophy, and go over the efficacy data of Viltepso, and also finish with safety and tolerability profile. So as many of you would know and are very familiar with, what causes Duchenne muscular dystrophy is mutations in the dystrophin gene. The way we think about this is dystrophin is a very large gene, and the dystrophin protein is the largest protein. So what happens is the analogy that I always use with families is, how does DNA get transcribed to a functional protein? So this is something that we think about, and we know a lot in Duchenne muscular dystrophy, because we know that any mutations in the DNA do not get transcribed and get translated into a functional protein. So how do we go about understanding this? So the analogy that I use with families is, when you go to a restaurant, you want to make an order for a dinner, and what is listed on the menu is the entrees that are available. So that is really the DNA. What happens is the person who's going to help you will take that back to the chef and hopefully will prepare a nice meal and get this delivered back to you, which is the protein. So what happens in Duchenne muscular dystrophy is that there is really a mutation at the DNA level, so which means that the transcription, so the DNA doesn't get transcribed into mRNA, and therefore there is no signal that comes from the mRNA to make this into a functional protein. It is really the lack of this non-functional protein that results in muscle fragility and in clinical symptoms. Next, please. So although we know that this is extremely common, we clinically, and I'm sure many of you have gone through this odyssey of really having to establish the diagnosis. So many parents would come and tell us that there is very clear evidence that there is a delay in motor milestones, which was recognized very, very early, sometimes in infancy, sometimes in early childhood, but this never gets diagnosed until the child is about 4.5 years. So Duchenne muscular dystrophy is an X-linked disease. What that means is that the boys are affected, but women are carriers. So 1/3 of them are carriers, which is extraordinarily rare for a female child to be manifesting, but that can still happen. It's 1 in a million, this are manifesting carriers. Currently, we know that there is no cure for Duchenne muscular dystrophy, but that said, there is very robust data to know that corticosteroids commence between 4 to 7 years predominantly really can change the natural course of this disease. There is also a CDC mandated standardized guidelines, which has been very well supported by PPMD, which shows that the way we care about these boys is really using a multidisciplinary approach. This includes paying attention to their skeletal health, but also respiratory health and cardiac health. And in terms of cardiac health, we do recommend ACE inhibitors and beta blockers to prevent the deterioration of cardiac muscles. And this usually is begun after age 10. Next, please. So there is a lot of historical data which shows that age 7 is sort of a cornerstone in terms of a decline in motor functions. And what do I mean by that? Although many parents would say that their early motor milestones are delayed, between ages 4 to 6, we also recognize what is called a honeymoon period. This is because that the boys are gaining skeletal muscle and there is growth. So there is actually gain in terms of motor functions if you watch them and measure them over time. However, when it comes to about age 7, then they begin to decline regardless of the mutation. So some of the measures which are used in the clinic are two functional measures, and one is called the 6-minute walk test, and the other one is called the North Star ambulatory assessment. So the 6-minute walk test, as you can see here in the figure, the yellow is a child who is less than 7 years of age, and the green marks someone who's older than 7. So you can see over a 2-year period that there is some gains or stable effect of the 6-minute walk test in a child who's less than 7. But as soon as they say 7 or older, there is a very clear and steady decline over a 2-year period. This is also very similar to a North Star. So the baseline is about, somewhere around 23. It kind of stays stable over 1 to 2 years, but especially in someone less than 7 years of age. But in someone who's older than 7, you can see again this parallels the 6-minute walk test, and there is a very steady decline over a 2-year period. Next, please. So we know that drug development in Duchenne muscular dystrophy is fraught with failures. So the FDA does provide guidance, and this is the document that came out from the FDA, which talks about what are the metrics that the industry has to use. And this was really drawn with a lot of support from key stakeholders. And one of the things that they do recommend in this guidance document is that early treatment in Duchenne muscular dystrophy is absolutely critical to preserve skeletal muscle health. Next, please. So what is the concept of exon skipping? So this is a very high-level slide, and what it shows on the top one is someone who is healthy and who can have what are called all of the soup alphabets. So these are depictions of a single exon. So and then in between are what are called introns. So someone who's healthy, these soup alphabets get arranged, and then you would get a full-length dystrophin protein which is produced. However, what happens in someone who has a Duchenne mutation is that there might be some of these alphabets which are missing. So when they are not able to be read in sequence, we call this an out-of-frame mutation. What that means is that there would be no functional dystrophin that is produced. So what does the exon skipping drug do? So the drug would go bind to the site of mutation and will restore this soup alphabets so that they can fall back again in sequence. What this would mean is that there is a small amount of functional protein, not the full length, but a shortened dystrophin, which contains all of the functional critical elements needed to stabilize the skeletal muscle is produced. So what we would achieve is that stabilization of function of the skeletal muscle and hopefully gain in function as well. Next, please. So when it comes to Viltepso really targets the sequences which are affected by with exon 53 skipping. So there is a list of mutations which Viltepso is able to restore, and that's listed out here. So again, shown here is that what Viltepso does is that it's exon 53 skipping. So what it would mean is to bind the site of this mutation and then restore these reading sequences and then produce functional protein. Next, please. So how did NS Pharma go about doing this? So there were two studies in young boys. Both of them recruited about 16 boys in total. So there was the initial study, which had the lower dose, so that was 40 milligrams per kilogram, and then the second one, which was 80 milligrams per kilogram. And there was an initial 4-week period, and then followed by 20 weeks. So this is kind of like industry standards about where the initial trial design spans about 24 weeks. So what they did in terms of the primary outcome was to go make sure that the drug is safe and that it's tolerable, but also to make sure that the medication is efficacious, because we want to know that the dystrophin, which is really a biomarker for Duchenne muscular dystrophy, is restored. And the way we would detect this is using Western blot from muscle biopsy. Some of the secondary outcomes that this trial included was to look at dystrophin mRNA and protein assessments, but also several of the time function tests. So we'll talk a little bit about this later, but this includes the time to stand, the 6-minute walk test, the time to run, walk, 4-step, time to climb 4 stairs, and the North Star, and also quantitative muscle testing. Next, please. So what is shown here is the demographics of the age and weight and height. And as you can see, based on the FDA guidelines, there was a really conscious effort to include as young as possible. So the mean age was quite well matched. So out of the 16, the mean age of enrollment was around 7. And you can see that the BMI, that showed just a little bit of a spread. So who were the ones who got enrolled? So mostly Caucasians, but all of them were aged between 4 to less than 10 years of age. They were able to walk independently and then able to complete all of these time function tests, and that they fulfilled screening criteria. It's very well understood that corticosteroids do change the natural history of the disease. So one of the criteria was that there was a stable corticosteroid. It did allow for stable use of corticosteroids for up to 3 months prior to study entry. Next, please. So to me, this is one of the most exciting things. So what did the study show? So based on the skeletal muscle biopsy results, so we do find that the Viltepso induced robustly dystrophin. And as I mentioned, dystrophin is really the biomarker for Duchenne muscular dystrophy. So from baseline, where none of these children had very little dystrophin, you can see after treatment in the small cohort, there was close to a 6% increase in dystrophin as detected by Western blot. Next, please. So this shows the 8 patients, and you can see that in every single one of them, there was restoration of dystrophin. There was some variability in the amount of dystrophin that was expressed, but you can see that up to 88% of the boys showed robust levels of dystrophin. There's some evidence to suggest that it's really 3% or above is sufficient to change the phenotype in Duchenne muscular dystrophy. But we know that the more is better, and what this graph shows is really there was really every single patient who was in this showed robust increase in dystrophin production when they received Viltepso. Next, please. This is again several images taken from the skeletal muscle, where we show that following treatment, there's really beautiful expression of dystrophin that is shown here. This is sitting right underneath the muscle membrane, and then showing that the restoration of dystrophin is also able to restore the whole complex. So when they overlay with another molecule called sarcoglycan or laminin, you can see beautiful co-expression of dystrophin with these proteins. Next, please. So in addition to the other measures that we talked about, such as dystrophin Western blot, some of the secondary endpoints was to look at what is really the efficiency of skipping. So this is done by a metric called RT-PCR, and you can see that after treatment, about the percentage of skipping efficiency was 44%. And this was also measured by mass spectrometry. So we measure the peptides, which are restored. So this went up from 0.6% to 4.2%. And then the immunofluorescence, which is again done on the scalp muscle, showed a very robust increase from about 2% to 35%. Next, please. So the FDA guidance is very clear. Even though there would be an increase in the biomarker, which is dystrophin, they really do want to make sure that in terms of functional outcome measures, that there is a robust increase, or at least in terms of efficacy, there is an improvement in the motor measures. So, what this data shows is those who were treated with Viltepso were actually compared to what are called historical controls. The historical controls comes from one of the largest natural history studies, which enrolled about 300 boys with Duchenne muscular dystrophy. And if you were to follow them over time, you would see that this time to run walk 10 meters in someone who has not been treated tends to stay flat or decline over 24 weeks. However, those who received Viltepso showed robust increase in time to run walk. And this on the right hand is basically the same data just shown as velocity, so meters per second. Again, this is to emphasize when compared to historical controls who remained stable or began to show decline after 24 weeks, there was an increase in the timed measures in those who were treated with Viltepso. Next, please. So again, the second metric, the functional outcome that was used was the time to stand, and then the 6-minute walk test. Again, compared to the historical controls, you can see someone who's not treated would steadily decline, whereas somebody who had received Viltepso stayed stable the first 12 weeks, but began to show gains with treatment. Very similar with 6-minute walk test, decline over time, but those who received Viltepso showed gains in the 6-minute walk time. Next, please. So in terms of adverse reactions, which has been commonly reported in this, about more than 50% had reported URI symptoms and some injection sites, but others include symptoms such as cough and pyrexia and abdominal pain, and limiting things like abdominal pain and urticaria as well. Next, please. All right. So this is data that just came out where NS Pharma had conducted an open label extension. So those who were enrolled in the initial study continued, and there was a push to go with the 80 per kilogram dose. So this was an extension which went up to 192 weeks. Next, please. So the optional extension study, the primary outcome here was the time to stand, and the secondary outcome measures was the time to run walk, but also the other measures that we talked about, the 6-minute walk test, the time to climb, and then the NSSA. Throughout this period, safety was also assessed. Next, please. All right. So what did the extension study show? Again, we are here talking about the time to stand. This is the second. It's recorded in seconds. And what the slide here on the right hand shows is the time to stand in terms of velocity, so meters per second. So compared to the Synergy historical data, you can see the time to stand in those who received Viltepso stayed same, or the rate of decline was much slower compared to the historical controls. And this is also depicted in terms of velocity. So whereas someone who was never treated would show a steady decline, there is stabilization and then a slower decline in someone who received Viltepso. Next, please. So the other two measures that were shown was the time to run walk. Again, this is on the left hand, it's shown in seconds. In the right hand, it's velocity. Compared to someone who was a historical control, the time to run walk stays stable, and over a period of time, very slow decline. And this is also depicted here in terms of the velocity. Next, please. So in terms of time to climb, both in terms of how we look at it per second in terms of velocity, again, compared to the historical controls, Viltepso showed greater improvement and then steady decline over time, but much greater compared to someone who was not treated. And very similarly, when we calculate this as a function of velocity, very similar results showing that compared to historical controls, Viltepso, there's a great gain in terms of time and also a slower decline. Next, please. So in terms of the safety profile, the common symptoms which was reported was URI symptoms, some rash and vomiting, some headache and nasal congestions. Next, please. In any clinical trial, we want to absolutely make sure that safety is, especially there are no serious adverse effects. So this study again reminds us that there was no serious treatment effects which was reported in the trial. However, there were some adverse events which was reported, but none of this was considered to be study drug. So this was the three adverse effects that was reported include femur fracture and rhabdomyolysis. Rhabdomyolysis just means very quick and life-threatening breakdown of muscle. And then there was one who reported mobilum fracture. Next, please. So how is Viltepso recommended and used? So Viltepso is given as an 80 milligram kilogram and intravenous infusion. This can either be done at home or at an ambulatory setting. It's usually based on patient's weight and it's done weekly. And again, as I mentioned, this infusion is done over a 1 hour period. It can either be done at home or at a treatment center. What we try to practice here is that at the commencement of treatment, we usually try to do this in-house for the first 1 to 2 doses, but then we transition so that the patient can get this at home. Next, please. So in sum, I want to say that Viltepso is indicated for those who are amenable to exon 53 skipping. 100% of patients who received Viltepso showed a robust increase in dystrophin. Again, this is critical because dystrophin is the biomarker for Duchenne muscular dystrophy, and restoring this is fundamental to any treatment approach. It can be done either at home or in a treatment center as an IV infusion. And it shows in terms of a safety profile to be very robust, safe drug. The most commonly reported adverse effects was upper respiratory infection, cough, and what I summarized was the initial phase 1 trial, but also the 4-year functional data, which shows how this drug is doing compared to historical controls. Next, please. That brings us to the last slide.
Thank you, Dr. Thangarajh, for that excellent presentation on the clinical data for Viltepso. My name is Robert Crozier, and I'm the Director of Medical Affairs here at NS Pharma. And I just have a couple of slides to share with you all today. The first slide is shown here, which outlines the clinical development program for Viltepso. And shown in the gray boxes are those studies that have completed, and in the blue boxes are ongoing studies. And I'm going to direct your attention to the right-hand side of the slide, where my laser pointer is. And the two boxes at the top, the gray boxes, are those studies that were presented by Dr. Thangarajh. The first is the phase 2 24-week study, and this was the registration study. It had primarily the Western blot data in it, where we saw a 6% increase in dystrophin expression relative to baseline. And then the open label extension study, this too is also in North America. It's an open label trial, and that was also presented by Dr. Thangarajh and shows the 4-year functional outcomes data. Below that are the two ongoing studies. The first is, you may be aware of it, is RACER 53. It is required by the FDA, and it's a phase 3 randomized, double-blind, placebo-controlled trial assessing the efficacy and safety of Viltepso, 80 milligrams per kilogram per week. It's a 1-year study, and it's a global trial. And it's currently recruiting patients with enrollment going well. And we anticipate that this study will read out late next year in 2024. Below that is Galactic 53. This is an open label efficacy and safety study in DMD boys who are ambulant and non-ambulant and who are at least 8 years of age and older. It too is 80 milligrams per kilogram per week for 1 year. The enrollment for this study is completed. We hope that the study will finish at the end of this year in 2023, and we anticipate sharing data from this study next year. Shown on this slide are the exon skipping programs that we have in our pipeline, or suite of programs that are sort of next up in clinical studies. We've talked a lot about exon 53 amenable patients for Viltepso. And so shown below that are two studies that are next in the queue. One is for those patients who are amenable to exon 44 skipping, and the other is for exon 50 skipping. And we'll take a pragmatic approach. They're both shown as roughly the same point in clinical development. And so whichever study is ready first is the one that we will start. Beneath that are 3 additional exon skipping therapy trials earlier in clinical development. One is for exon 45, 51, and 55. And although each of these exon skipping therapies targets only a subset of patients, it's important to point out that in totality, they may cover up to 40% of all DMD patients. And lastly, I wish to mention CAP-1002. This is a cell-based therapy being developed by Capricor Therapeutics, and we have entered into a licensing agreement with Capricor to distribute CAP-1002, hopefully once it's approved by the FDA. Importantly, CAP-1002 is not mutation dependent, so this is a different approach from the exon skipping therapies, and it operates by a different mechanism or a different way from exon skipping agents. And we're hopeful that it will actually work in a synergistic way with exon skipping therapies. Importantly, it has a phase 3 trial that's ongoing and recruiting patients. The trial is called HOPE-3. And for more information about that study, including sites, study sites, you can go to clinicaltrials.gov for more information. And it's recruiting patients who are both ambulant and non-ambulant. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Robert and Dr. Thangarajh, for those presentations this morning. As I mentioned earlier, my name is Judy Cohen. I'm the Associate Director of Patient Services and Advocacy. I'm going to be speaking to you this morning a little bit about our NS Support Program and the services that they offer. NS Support is a patient services program that provides services to both our providers as well as our patients. As soon as a start form is submitted to our NS Support team, they conduct a rapid benefit investigation, determine your eligibility for various programs, including our copay assistance program. They also investigate options for infusion centers, as well as doing home infusion. The team there is highly responsive and provides follow-up with both our payers, our providers, and patients. The NS Support team is comprised of a group of individuals that provide support to our team, including case managers, the Director of Patient Access, as well as our patient engagement team. The case managers are focused on calling our payers, doing the benefit investigation. The directors of patient access really provide a lot of support to our providers and their staff with access and affordability issues. Our patient engagement team works very closely with our patients and caregivers to provide personalized access support and coordinate care and help reduce delays throughout the treatment journey. This picture here gives you an idea of what to expect when you're on the NS Support patient journey. From the time the start form or enrollment form is received, the case manager will do a benefit investigation, review your benefits and copay costs, help your provider with the prior authorization assistance. Like I mentioned, also providing insights about home infusion and site of care options, working through any denials with exceptions and appeals, and then provide that ongoing support and follow-up calls. The team there is just dedicated to ensure a smooth, seamless journey and help you along the way. Our NS Support team can be reached at 833-NS-SUPPORT. If you'd like to also get in touch with our patient support team at NS Pharma, you can reach that team at patients@NS Pharma. Thank you very much.